The rain poured heavily outside the towering glass skyscraper, streaking down its shimmering windows like tiny rivers. Inside, the grand lobby of Lexington Industries buzzed with tension. Employees whispered among themselves, eyes darting toward the far end of the room. A scene so absurd, so impossible, was unfolding right before them. At the center of the lobby, beneath a crystal chandelier that cost more than most people's homes, sat two men at a sleek wooden chessboard. One of them was Victor Langston, the billionaire CEO of Lexington Industries. Ruthless, sharp, and known for his brutal leadership, Victor was the kind of man who never accepted defeat. He had built his empire from the ground up, crushing competition and dismissing anyone he deemed unworthy. And right now, he was staring at the chessboard with an expression no one had ever seen on his face. Uncertainty. His opponent, a janitor, not just any janitor, George Miller, a quiet, unassuming man in his late 50s, with worn-out shoes, calloused hands, and a faded uniform. He wasn't supposed to be here. He wasn't supposed to be sitting across from one of the most powerful men in the country. And yet, here he was, his fingers gently tapping the table. As he studied the board, a calm, unreadable look on his face. It all started earlier that morning. Victor had stormed through the office, frustrated over a deal gone wrong. His temper was infamous, and when he was angry, no one was safe. As he passed the break room, he overheard laughter. Loud, carefree, irritated him. Who had the audacity to be so relaxed while he was dealing with a crisis? Peering inside, he saw a small group of employees gathered around a chessboard, and at the center of it all was George, the janitor, effortlessly dismantling his opponent's strategy. Victor had smirked, stepping inside. "What's going on here?" His voice had an edge to it, and the room went silent. One of the younger employees, nervous under Victor's gaze, hesitated before answering. Just a quick game, sir. George is, well, he's really good." Victor raised an eyebrow, then looked at the janitor. "Really good, huh?" He chuckled. "Well, George, let's see how good you really are. A challenge, a game. But the stakes? That was where it got interesting." Victor, in his arrogance, had decided to make things more entertaining. "Tell you what," he said, leaning against the counter. "If you win, I'll give you anything you want. Name it." The room had gone completely still. No one expected George to take the offer seriously. After all, what could a janitor possibly want from a billionaire? But then, George had tilted his head, considering the offer carefully. "Anything?" Victor smirked. "Anything." A pause. And then, in a voice as steady as his hands, George said, "I want your job." Laughter had erupted in the room. Employees whispered to each other, some in shock, others barely containing their amusement. But George, he wasn't laughing. He was serious. Victor's eyes had narrowed. He didn't like being challenged, especially not by someone he considered beneath him. But the idea of crushing the janitor in front of his own employees, that was too tempting to resist. "All right then," he said with a confident grin. "Let's play." Now here they were. The game began, and the lobby fell into an eerie silence. Employees who had never paid much attention to George now watched him with wide eyes. Some were excited, some were nervous, and others couldn't believe this was even happening. A billionaire CEO playing chess against a janitor. It felt unreal. But as the pieces moved across the board, something became clear. George wasn't just playing. He was dominating. Victor started strong, opening with aggressive moves, confident as always. He was a man used to winning, both in business and in life. But George, He played differently. There was no rush, no overconfidence. Every move was deliberate, careful, like he could see 10 steps ahead. His hands, rough from years of work, moved with surprising precision. The more he played, the more people realized this wasn't luck. This wasn't just a fluke. George was a master. Victor's smug expression slowly faded as frustration set in. He adjusted his tie, drummed his fingers against the table, and exhaled sharply every time George counted his moves. The employees whispered among themselves. Could this really be happening? Could George actually win? To understand how a janitor ended up in this position, you had to go back years, long before he was pushing a mop through these halls. George wasn't just some ordinary janitor. Decades ago, he had been a rising chess prodigy, a name whispered in chess clubs and tournaments. He had dreams, big ones, but life had other plans. A family tragedy forced him to step away from competitions. Instead of chasing championships, he took whatever jobs he could to support his younger siblings. One thing led to another, and years passed. Chess became a private thing, something he played in quiet moments, a skill no one around him knew about. But just because he wasn't in the spotlight didn't mean he had lost his brilliance. Every night, after long shifts, he played online, studied grandmaster strategies, and kept his mind sharp. Chess had never left him. And now, here he was, facing a man who had everything, yet still underestimated him. Victor, on the other hand, had built his empire on control. He wasn't the kind of man who let things slip away from him. He had fought for his success, outsmarted competitors, and crushed those who stood in his way. He had always believed that intelligence and strategy were what made a person powerful. And yet, here he was, being outplayed by someone he had never even noticed before today. The tension grew thick as the game neared its final moments. Victor's moves became reckless. He was losing control, and he hated it. Employees held their breath, some silently rooting for George, others just too stunned to pick a side. Then it happened. George made his move. A quiet, simple checkmate. The room erupted. Gasps, murmurs, stunned silence. Victor leaned back in his chair, staring at the board like he couldn't comprehend what had just happened. He had lost. To a janitor. George sat still, his expression calm. He didn't gloat, didn't celebrate. He simply met Victor's stunned gaze and said, "Looks like I win." For the first time in his life, Victor had nothing to say. The man, who always had a plan, always had control, was now sitting in front of a checkmate he never saw coming. The deal was made, and now there was only one question left. What happened next? The room was frozen in shock. No one moved. No one spoke. The weight of what had just happened hung in the air like an unspoken secret. Victor Langston, the billionaire CEO, had lost. And not just to anyone, to a janitor, a man he had never given a second thought. Victor's face was unreadable, his jaw tight, his hands clenched into fists on the table. The employees, still too stunned to process everything, waited for his reaction. Would he laugh it off? Would he storm out? Would he go back on his word? After all, he was the one with all the power, wasn't he? But George didn't look at him like a defeated man. He sat there, quiet and composed, as if this moment was never about proving a point or humiliating anyone. He wasn't looking for revenge, for status, or for power. He had simply played the game the way he always had. With patience, with skill, and with clarity. Victor exhaled sharply and ran a hand through his hair. "Well," he said finally, his voice lacking its usual arrogance. "A deal's a deal." A murmur swept through the crowd. Was he serious? Was he actually going to go through with it? Employees exchanged glances, barely able to process the idea. George tilted his head. "You don't have to do anything," he said, his voice steady. "I didn't take this game to take something from you." Victor studied him, his sharp eyes searching for any sign of mockery, any sign that George was enjoying this. But there was none. And maybe that was what made it even harder to accept. George had won, and yet he wasn't using this moment to tear him down. After a long pause, Victor leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. His voice was lower now, less performative, almost thoughtful. "You beat me fair and square," he admitted. "And I keep my word." The room was silent again, but this time, it was different. In the days that followed, rumors spread like wildfire. Some thought Victor would never actually step down, that he would find a way to wiggle out of the deal. Others thought George would reject the offer entirely. But then, something no one expected happened. Victor called a company-wide meeting. Employees gathered in the same grand lobby where the match had taken place. The air buzzed with anticipation. When Victor finally spoke, his words were clear, direct, and unlike anything they had heard from him before. "I've spent my life believing power comes from knowing how to win," he said. "But today I learned something else. Power also comes from knowing when you've been outplayed." He paused, scanning the crowd. George Miller is a man who sees things differently. He thinks ahead, he adapts, and he understands the people around him better than I ever did. Then, he turned to where George stood among the employees. "Which is why I'm making a decision that most people would call crazy." His lips twitched in the faintest of smiles. "I'm stepping down. And George, if he wants it, the position is his." Gasps filled the room. It felt impossible, surreal. Employees looked at George, who stood still, his face unreadable. George didn't answer right away. He could feel every eye on him, waiting. But after a long moment, he took a breath and finally spoke. "I never wanted to be CEO," he said. "But I do believe this company needs a leader who understands the value of every person here." A long pause. Then he looked at Victor. "If you're really stepping down, I want to make one thing clear. I won't run things the way you did." Victor smirked, nodding slightly. "That's the point, isn't it?" And just like that, the unimaginable had happened. In the months that followed, Lexington Industries changed. George, with his quiet intelligence and steady presence, brought a new kind of leadership, one that valued strategy, but also people. He didn't just run the company. He listened. He observed. And just like in chess, he always thought 5 steps ahead. As for Victor, he didn't vanish. He had lost the match, lost his position, but somehow he had gained something else, perspective. He traveled, took time away from the world of corporate power, and for the first time in his life, he started learning how to play the game from a different angle. And so, the story ended not with defeat, but with transformation. A billionaire learned that power wasn't just about winning. A janitor became more than anyone ever imagined. And in the end, it was never just about chess. It was about seeing the whole board differently.